Hello and welcome back to WTF MCP, where we give you all the real tips from an award-winning painter. That's me, Jay Shalansky. That's Tim France from Professional Casual Network.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. So last week we in the like towards the end of last week's episode, Tim and I kind of realized that that was a two-parter. So we're gonna pick up where we left off last week and continue talking about hobby. Tim, do you have any topics overall that you wanted to cover that we didn't cover last week?
Yeah, so one thing that I've always been curious and how it's done is kind of some of the spell effects or like energy sources, say
Sure.
like Psylocke's blades. Cyclops is like the actual like laser in his visor, things
Yep.
like that. Like how do you build that type of thing up? And is that something that's really foundational in the way you prime it at the beginning? Are you priming white there to kind of get
Yeah.
that effect later? Or is that something that you can kind of do after the model is done, especially if you slap chopped or speed painted something and you want it to be able to apply those effects later on.
Yeah. So this is a great question, and this applies across any type of light. So whether it's fire or energy or magic, right? If you look at a fire, right? If we use our minds to imagine a fire, as you come from the center, like you have your wood pile here, right? And as you come out from the center, whenever light works, it's always brightest towards the middle, and then as it comes out to the edge, it's its true color, right? So with fire, it's red and then into like this darker, like black with the smoke, right? But red is always on the outside and then orange, yellow, white. Okay. So
Okay.
if you look at a lightsaber, the middle of the lightsaber is always bright white. And then it kind of fades into whatever color it is to the outside of the lightsaber. So, like if you have a blue lightsaber, dark blue, it's always on the outside of the lightsaber, and then it fades into that white. So, for when you're painting that, you decide what color. So let's say Cyclops visor's tough because it's small, but let's use what's who's the girl with the blade behind her back when that's she's X-Men.
Psylocke
Is it Psylocke or
with the big pink
yeah.
energy
Or no, the
psychic
one where
sword.
she's like going like this and the
Oh,
sword is in
magic.
magic. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great one. Okay. So let's say with Magic's blade and the power at the bottom, it's ultimately purple. That's the color you choose. You want it to be purple, okay?
Hmm.
So when you're painting, paint the whole thing purple, the dark purple that you want it to be. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take your purple, you're going to take a white, and you're going to mix a little bit of white into your purple on your palette in front of you. And
Oh,
then what you're going to do is start from the middle and work your way out until you're like a little bit from the edge, and you're going to have to feel this. This is not, I can't, it's hard for me to explain to you like how far from the edge you should be, but you want it to be like a gradient that's working its way in. So again, if we look at my hand, the lightest is here and it gradients down. So really the true color of my hand or this particular paint that we're doing is this flesh tone tan dark red here. So you would start with that color, you'd add a little white to it, then you'd paint it all and you'd stop like here. Then you'd add a little bit more white, start from the middle, paint it up again, add a little bit more white, start from the middle. And then depending on how bright you want that light to be, the source, then the middle would almost be pure white.
okay. So it's kind of like reverse.
Yeah,
Is reverse building kind of make
yeah,
sense there?
that's
Interesting.
exactly right. And so, unlike the slap chop or how we were doing lights before, you're doing the reverse. And it's almost the same way when we were talking about object source light. It's the same way you're building that too. You're going from dark to light. And so
So
you
that
always want to start with the darkest color you think that color is going to be like so Cyclops visor dark red and then build it up and then figure out where the source of the light is coming from. If it's the center of whatever the object is, that's going to be pure white. If it's a lightsaber, it's the center like all the way up. If it's his visors, it's from his two eyes, but it kind of comes like across here, right?
mhm.
So this there'd be a line between my two eyes that would be completely white and then it would go white to pink to red.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah, So like in my mind, when I'm thinking about a lightsaber or magic sword or something like
Yeah.
that, I'm like, oh well, I'm painting the whole thing purple, and then I'm like adding a thin white line in the middle, but that's obviously incorrect.
I mean, I
Uh,
think that's the easiest way to do it. If you don't have time for all those steps that I just gave you, you could do maybe not white, but I would do like for her magic sword, right? You could go purple and then just maybe lighten up the purple a little bit and just go
mhm.
like through the middle, and that would give you a very good effect at the same time. And then you could build it up from there later on.
All right, I like that a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, as far as your award-winning display piece,
Yeah, yeah.
um, were there any models in there that you kind of like went out of your way to do special effects on to make sure that it was, because we've talked a lot about like learning to paint and
Yeah.
some of the basics, but as far as some advanced techniques, what were some of the more in-depth things that you did in that particular display board to really make them pop?
Yeah, so and just to be clear, my buddy Nick and I worked on that together. So some of these techniques are things that he did
Mhm.
as well. So I just want to put that out there and make that clear. But I think,
Award-winning painter, Nick.
yeah, Keebler, for those of you in the know. Um, yeah, so I think some of the neat stuff, particularly that he spent time on was like Cable's energy shield.
Hmm.
Just because that one is just such a cool, it's just such this cool octagon like shield effect that has to look almost translucent but have some sort of energy and power to it. There's a couple different ways you can do that. With energy effects like that are supposed to be translucent, you're reversing what we just told you about. So instead of going darkest from the outside to lightest to the inside, you're going darkest from the inside to lightest on the outside.
Okay.
And so any sort of like hologram effect or anything that's going to be translucent, quote unquote, we can't really make it translucent because it's hard plastic, but anything like that, you want the darkest on the inside and go out to the light. Because if you look at any sort of an energy shield, or like if you looked at that in a cartoon or something, right? When you look through those octagons, you could see through the middle, but as the octagons get closer, it's like the energy's touching itself, touching each other, and so those become brighter. So when you're doing energy effects like that, where two pieces of energy are touching each other, the brighter piece is going to be where the two pieces are touching, not the center.
Gotcha. So like, and is there a difference between like, say, if it was one piece like a Scarlet Witch spell effect over like the cable shield, like where you're doing those differently? Like if there's multiple segments of
Yeah,
like either energy source or light?
yeah, it would be because you're almost doing both, right? So, like for instance, with like Scarlet Witch, you would show the source of the power of the light coming out. But then if that power, smoke or power energy is touching another piece of power energy, well, then it would become lighter again back where the two are touching.
Okay.
So like if I have two lights, okay, one here and one here, they're both super bright here and here. And as they converge, it's actually bright here too. Now it's not as bright as the source, but it's brighter than them by themselves, if that makes any sense. So
You're
you know
really
what I
kind of
mean?
weaving them together.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And so anytime two energies, whatever they are, but anytime two energy, magic, or anything is touching, you're going to get a brighter between the two when the two are touching. Like, so between my two fingers here, that's going to be brighter than it would be here in the middle when you're trying to look through it.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Let's see some of the other cool stuff. I think Nick spent a lot of time on Professor X. Um, especially his chair. And one of
Yeah.
the neat things that a lot of people talked about was how the chair was yellow but also metallic.
Yeah.
And so basically, an easy breakdown of it was a base color that was kind of borderline gold, not so metallic, but almost.
Hmm.
And then color that, then a wash over that to get those. So wash basically outs differently um from speed paints. Wash is only meant to go in the recesses. Now,
Gotcha.
when you put wash on, it will darken your color, but it'll really darken the recesses, and that's what a wash is supposed to do, is find all the recesses and darken them up. So we put the base color on his chair. We put a wash tone on it so that it would darken up the recesses, and then we did a highlight dry brush of some metals. So then it looks like yellow, but kind of metal. And so it's just this really, really good effect that made it different from other, Xavier chairs.
Now, is there any benefit to priming and painting some of those pieces separately, especially when you have something like a large metal chair? Maybe this character is not in MCP, but maybe one day. But
Yeah.
like the mutant hunter guys that had like the dude who had the torso and gun
Oh,
hands
yeah,
and
yeah,
like had
yeah.
the big treads for feet. Like, is there any benefit to like priming and painting those separately before kind of connecting those two very different materials or textures?
Yeah,
Or is that
it,
overkill?
this is sometimes dependent on the artist, right? And so there are pieces like a lot of people, especially if they're doing like worthy level painting,
Hmm.
they will separate that face, won't put the head on the body, and do that separately just because a lot of people when they're looking at miniatures, they'll look at the face, right? So
Hmm.
the face is almost one of the most important parts of when you're trying to win an award for like a model. And so a lot of people do the head separately. So I guess the answer to your question is if there's an important piece on your model, if you're trying to really like showcase it, if there's a real important piece that's a different color, like you wouldn't take Hulk's head off because Hulk's his body and his head are supposed to be one tone, and that would be really hard to paint that separately. But if
Yeah.
you have two separate tones, like maybe you paint Xavier's chair, the whole chair first, and then paint Xavier separately and then put him in there. That would be something that would be reasonable to do.
One thing I know that I've always been intimidated about with faces are eyes and eyebrows details around those particular
Yeah.
sections. I've heard a lot of people just they're like, you know what? No, I don't paint eyes.
Yeah.
I never put it on there. I've seen
Yeah.
people use those little tiny super fine like felt
I
paint
have a
pens
trick
to
for
just bop
this.
bop.
I have a trick
What's
for this.
yeah,
I
what's your go-to?
I go small to large. Okay. So I paint the whole eye black. Then I go
Okay.
over it with white and try to just like miss the pupil area. It's not easy, but then you go over it with white and just, you paint. So if you look at my eyes, right, you're not worried about the color of my eyes. You just want the pupil, right? So what I do is I go black first, whole eye black. Then I come in and I paint the white and I just don't paint where I want the pupil to be. Then I come over that and I would paint my flesh tone over it and just not paint where I want the eye to be. So I go small to large. And then that's
Oh.
that's the easiest way because you can fix it at every step, right?
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. Multiple opportunities to reroll.
To re-roll. Yeah.
Yep. Now as far as like choosing where your pupil or where your character's looking, I know a lot of people get very intimidated by like I don't want my character to look
Yeah.
cross-eyed or like
Right.
their eyes are going in different directions. Um, and I've seen some very good eyes done that look great from the angle you are supposed to be looking at, but then not as much
Yeah.
if you like turn them slightly. Do you have any cheats or trips or ticks
Yeah.
there?
For me, I always want them looking into my eyes. So if I'm holding them, I want to be like I'm making eye contact with the mini.
Hmm.
And so that's the best way I could describe it is you either look at yourself in a mirror and just look at yourself in the mirror and see where your eyes are and then mimic that on the mini and I found that that's the best way unless they have some sort of thing like they're holding in their hand that's interesting, then you can maybe like make them look over there. But if you just want to simplify it, because whenever anybody picks up a mini, they're going to look at the face, right? And they're going to pick
Yeah.
it up to their eye level and they're going to look right at it. So if you have it, so it's looking them back, right back in the eyes, that's what they're going to remember over like, oh, yeah, I set it on the table and Rogue was turned to the left a little bit. And now her eyes look weird that way. And it's like, well, look her in the face. Now they're perfect. And that's what people will remember versus like, oh, the eyes are slightly off from an angle.
Okay. I mean, we're really kind of between last week and this week, we're kind of getting a real crash course on like every little bit of a
Yeah,
model you might have a question on.
yeah,
Um, to add in one of the things that we haven't talked about, like what about weapons? Either
yeah,
metal, swords, guns, things with small lighting effects on them, potentially like like futuristic guns that have all sorts of buttons and things on them.
yeah.
What's the way to kind of build those up? And that is that different than some of the light effects that we did earlier with either like Psylocke or Magic or something like that?
Yeah, so I think again, it's, weapons are interesting, and I think a lot of people, their initial reaction when they paint a gun, let's say, is to go black. I like going gray and then building up from there. Or if you're using, if you're using speed paints, use the gray, not the black, and you're going to get a much better tone to it. The other
Hmm.
thing is you could use metal, if you want to use I don't recommend painting the whole thing in like a metal paint, but what you would do is you paint it like a dark gray. So like if you're using like army paint to be like a regiment gray, and then you would dry brush it with like a silver or a gunmetal. And basically that just brings up all the highlights and then it keeps the rest of the gun like a gray. Same with swords. Like, but listen, there's painters out there. I'm not one of these. I know Nick wants to start working on it, but is painting painting metal tones without using metallic paints. So non-metallic metal is what it's
Yeah.
called. That is very, very good painting, and it's very difficult to do. But if you want to do like Deadpool swords, start with maybe a little bit lighter of a gray, so right above a regiment gray, and then just dry brush it with like a silver, and that'll give you your
Oh.
metal effect right there.
I know I've seen a lot of discussion on some of the boards about people using non-metallic metal, specifically on like Cap Shield.
Oh yeah. So basically, for those of you who don't know what that means, there's two ways you paint metal. You paint it with metal paint, which basically gives you the reflections and all the highlights and stuff in the metal because it's reflecting light. Where normal acrylic paint does not reflect as high as like a metallic paint does.
Hmm.
Okay, so it's like when last week when we were talking matte versus gloss paint. So if you've seen a cap shield where they have like the highlights on it and you can see like the reflection, but it's not metal, it's actually painted on, that's non-metallic metallics. So you're basically doing a very similar system as what we talked about the light source stuff,
Hmm.
but you're doing it at less intervals. So the gradient is not as steep. Where like let's go to the fire again, right?
Hmm.
You're going red, orange, yellow, white. That's a steep gradient, right? Because you're actually changing colors on the color wheel. With non-metallic metals, you're going blue, tiny bit lighter blue, a tiny bit lighter blue, tiny bit lighter blue. You know what I
Gotcha.
mean? And
So
so
honestly,
you're
closer to the energy stuff you were talking about
yeah,
earlier.
yeah.
Okay.
But like in less intervals, right? So like even energy, to give like an energy effect, you want like a bright separation of colors. So if you look at a lightsaber, it's white, light green, dark green, right? That's how the energy stuff kind of works. If you want metallics, it's blue, blue, lighter blue, lighter blue, lighter blue, lighter, lighter,
Okay.
lighter. So it's not as steep of a gradient through the color wheel.
Okay. So I can see why that's kind of something that one would work for or work
Yeah,
towards being able to kind of build those colors because
yeah,
it seems like a kind of a more advanced technique.
right. Yeah, and I mean, this is all by brush, right? Like things become infinitely easier if you have access to an airbrush. Like things just are much easier to do.
Okay.
Because if for instance, let's say we're doing something with energy, right? When we were talking about magic sword, I said, "Hey, start with like a darker purple, add a little white to it, go. Well, with an airbrush, because the airbrush, basically how an airbrush works is you have paint coming out of the cylinder and then you have air that's like basically atomizing the paint, right? And
Mhm.
spreading it out and creating even smaller droplets of paint. So it's not as thick. So when you're using an airbrush, if you use more air than paint, you're going to get a lighter kind of shade. So you could start with that dark purple, put white in the airbrush and just go light, light, and it's going to bring up that purple. And then you could go all the way to white in the center. So an airbrush just allows you to do this quicker because of the way the paint comes out of the airbrush.
Gotcha. All right. Now, is it at all recommended for someone to try to start with an airbrush, or should you kind of always start traditional and then add that in later?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the thing with the airbrush is very similar to speed paints, that a lot of people believe once they've mastered airbrush that they're done,
Hmm.
but you're still always going to need to use a brush. And so I always recommend people start with the airbrush or start with a regular brush, just get comfortable with that, and then get into the airbrush and start working and seeing how you can add on to your, to your craft from there. And I think that's across all paints, all types of paints. Everything is starting basic and then adding things in as you get better to understand what they do.
If you had to like create like a list, right, for someone starting out, as far as what effects that they should really kind of be, or what techniques, or
Yeah.
what kind of basic building blocks of skills they should really kind of be focusing on first, what would be your first three?
Yeah. Work on coloring in the lines, like brush
Pr-
control. That's
Probably a good
number
one.
one. No matter what paint you're using, brush control is always, and for those of you like me, I have shaky hands. And so I found like getting one of the mini stands that holds, and then I basically hold my one hand that's holding the mini stand with the mini on top of it. I hold that hand on the table, and then I put my other hand on top of it, and that helps me steady my hand. So just brush technique and being able to color in the lines and understanding how your hands work, number one. Then number two would be dry brushing. So I think dry brushing is a technique that will save you tons of time and will get you to your end game faster, because very similar to an airbrush, if you paint all your solid colors, then you dry brush the whole mini, you're going to get those highlights anyways. So you could skip a bunch of a bunch of steps by doing solid paints, dry brush. And then after you got those two down, the next one to try is washes. And doing maybe even your own shadow tones. If you don't want to do it with a wash, you want to do it with straight paint, start with a
Mm.
dark green like for Hulk, and then build up to a little bit lighter of a green, lighter, until you get to the normal green, and then dry brush over. So if you can nail down brush control, highlights, and then shadows, your minis will be beautiful. And then that gives you the foundation for everything else you need. And then you can start working on lighting effects and all that stuff.
Okay, I like that a lot. Now, so we've picked up a handful of paints, a couple brushes, we've bought our Rust-Oleum or our primer and stuff. How do we keep what are kind of some of the go-to tricks to keeping our equipment in its best form so we're not either ruining brushes or
Right.
having to constantly buy new materials?
Yeah, so brushes in particular are very tough, right? So one of the things you always want to do is keep them clean. After you use them, after you're done using a certain paint, make sure you clean them in water, dry them off. Make sure the tip, you can basically, like, it's kind of like twisting the tip. So you just get your fingers on there and just make sure you twist it back into shape. Um, Companies like Monument Hobbies have this unicorn goop, they call it. It's basically like a soap that cleans and refines the brushes. So it's worth picking up. And then after you're done painting, make sure it's all washed, make sure paint doesn't dry on your brush, clean it off, and always store them vertically so that the paintbrush is up. It just helps. Like if you don't have that, it's fine to lay them on the table. But I've always find that sometimes you're not paying attention and you'll like push the brush or like move it, and all of a sudden it'll get stuck like against the wall or against something, and then
Oh
next thing
yeah.
you pick it up, your tip is like this, and now you got to work to straighten it out again. But yeah, I always keeping them clean and keeping them in a position where they're not going to touch other things, especially the tip. That's number one. Um, Always make sure you're closing all your paint bottles, because even though it may not seem like it did much and it just dried the tip, it's actually adding air into the paint, which is stopping some of the mixture and stuff. So closing your paint bottles, always shaking before you, like, whatever amount of time you think you shook your paint bottle and you thought was enough, go another minute, because it's
Okay.
just that's how it always is, because there's always paint in there that needs to be spun up
Now,
and remixed.
what are these little balls I see people putting in their
Yeah.
paint pots?
So basically what happens is the way paint is built is the chemicals separate. And so you potentially will get a thicker chemical of the paint, the dye itself will go towards the bottom of the pot. And then the top of the pot, the more the liquid, water or alcohol, what that's in there, will start to rise towards the top. So those little, they're like these little steel ball bearings. Most companies have them now. You put them in there. What it does is it's helping to get, instead of like putting a spoon in there, like if you were going to stir like a mixture that you're making for like bread or cookies or something, right? You're trying to get the spoon in there and really mix everything together. Well, you can't
Yeah.
do that in a paint pot. So you put these little metallic balls in there and they move back and forth between the two liquids, making sure it's all getting mixed together.
Okay, so it's more of an like an agitator, like an additional
Yeah,
agitator to.
yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
all right. And then wet pallets and dry pallets. I've
Yeah,
heard those terms.
yeah,
They both look like pallets to me.
yeah.
What's the difference, and why are you using one over the other? Or do you always use one? Is it like a preference? Will I prefer dry over wet, or
So
like what's the deal?
yeah, for me it depends. If I know it's a multi-day paint trip that I'm doing here, I will use a wet palette because basically what a wet palette does is it, for better, no better term, is it keeps the paint wet. So you seal it in. So think of anything that needs humidity, right? Like if you guys bake bread, when you're baking bread, you need to create a seal when you're letting it rise because it needs that moisture in order to stay in there so it doesn't dry out. Paint's the same way. Paint will dry out. So a wet palette is basically a sponge at the bottom. You put water in it, then a piece of paper that goes over the sponge, and you use the paper as a palette. And it's keeping water and moisture, not making the paint wet or mixed with the water, but just keeping it moist, enough
Oh,
moisture inside the system so that it doesn't dry out. So then when you're done painting, you close everything and seal that moisture in and keep the humidity in there. And then next time that paint's ready to go. So if you're, this only really matters is if you're mixing paints or if you don't remember what paints you're using, that's when you would use a wet palette, especially if you're doing it over multiple days. Now, if you're just, it's a 1 day paint and you don't need to keep it, you could just use a regular palette and you just paint, and then knowing that that paint's going to dry up eventually, that it's difficult to keep paint in a regular dry palette moist, to
yeah,
use again.
yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. Okay.
So yeah, I don't know, I think that was good. These two are
Yeah.
very long episodes, which is fine, but
Yeah.
much longer than our first few.
I mean, I think it's probably pretty rare out there to be able to get a full crash course in roughly half an hour, a little bit over
Yeah,
in two
from an
episodes. So
award-winning painter.
from an award-winning painter.
Yeah. But yeah, so those are all our hobby tips for this week. And yeah, next week we're going to talk about something else. So,
Sounds good.
all right. Thanks everybody. Thanks, Tim.